Hey everybody, it's the Scholar General Mojan Bing. In today's video, I'm actually responding to Matt Easton, who runs a channel called Scholagladiatoria. And he recently made a video where he's talking about the shape and form of various guards on swords throughout history. And whenever it came to the discard, he made a hypothesis. And his hypothesis was that because it has a discard, instead of parrying with the edge, like receiving oncoming blows with the edge, you would actually try to receive them with the flat of your own blade. And he made a comparison between this and the nagel, or the nail, that exists on the guard of a messer. Make sure you go check out Matt's video if you haven't seen it already. Because Matt Easton doesn't necessarily specialize in Chinese or Japanese weapons, he didn't emphasize this point very much, but I thought that this would be a good opportunity for me to comment on this, because I'm someone who, really digs into Chinese swords and the historical material associated with them, and I study these arts and that kind of thing. So I just want to come out and say that I do think that Matt Easton is correct, and I can provide a lot more context and evidence for how the discard is used. So in today's video, I'm going to talk about the discard on Dao and how it impacts use. I'm not going to talk about the origins of the discard, and I'm not going to talk too much about Jin. I'll talk about them a little bit, but mostly this video is going to be about the Dao and how the discard is used. And whenever I say that you receive blows on the flat of the blade or on the back of the blade, this doesn't mean that you would never parry with the edge. I mean, there's a difference in what you train and what actually happens, right? My claim is not that there were never blows parried with the edge of a Dao. My claim is that whenever they trained these arts in the past, they were training to parry with the spine or the flat. There are three forms of evidence I'm going to use in this video. Number one is the artifacts, right? The old sword, the antiques. Number two is the textual sources. So we have some texts from the Ming Dynasty and some from the Qing Dynasty that talk about how these weapons are used. And the third source is the living tradition of Chinese martial arts. Basically, I treat this kind of like an oral history where we have a passed down tradition and we can glean some insights into, swordsmanship in the, mid-Qing or late Qing based off things that exist in many Chinese forms and stuff. If we look at all three of these sources in combination, I think it's fairly safe to say that in China, people who were training to use the Dao in the past were training to primarily block blows with the spine or the flats of their blade and not with the edge. And the discard is important here because if you're blocking with the flat, it will catch an oncoming blow to keep it from hitting your hand. Now, when we're trying to look at antiques and extrapolate how they were used, and we're looking at damage and wear, there's a bunch of things we have to keep in mind. For one, swords rust and they're frequently polished and sharpened. So this changes the shape of the sword, and it can remove or change the appearance of damage to the blade. In addition to that, there's also an extremely small sample size. It's not like we have millions of blades that exist in the past and we can make like meta-analysis on these things. These are very much a very limited sample size, especially what I was able to access for this video. There's also this fact that the Dao was a battlefield weapon and it was a sidearm. So most of the time, the Dao is not going to be necessarily used against other Dao. It's going to be, you draw it when you're fighting against someone with a spear, if you've lost your weapon, or you have a shield with the Dao, and all of these dynamics can change the type of damage that we might expect to see on these weapons. All those caveats out of the way, I do think that there's compelling evidence on antiques which suggests that they were parrying with the flat of the spine as opposed to the edge of the blade. If we look at the metallurgical construction of Chinese blades, I also think that we can see how this would benefit from parrying with the flat or the spine as opposed to the edge. Two most common forms of blade construction in China were the sanmei and the qiangang. Sanmei means three-plate construction. And what you do is you take a hardened steel plate and then you sandwich it between two softer iron plates. And this is frequently used on jian. And it makes a sword which has, hard steel edges and a softer flats. Qiangang means inserted steel. This was frequently used on Dao. And what you do is you kind of make a blade out of softer material and then you insert a hard steel edge into it. Once you quench a blade like this, you're going to have a very strong, lasting edge, but it can be brittle if it's smashed into other steel. And on the flip side of this, the flats in the spine of a Dao are going to be able to take a lot more cuts before they break. The most that would usually happen is a little bit of deformation. Looking at antique dao, we can frequently see that there are nicks and gashes on the spine of blades, usually around the lower half of the blade. And if there's edge damage, it's usually concentrated in the upper half of the blade, where you'll be cutting against things. And with gen, there are some gen that have discards, and even ones that don't sometimes have marks and cuts into the flats of the blade. And this is not just something that I've seen on antiques. I've also talked about this with a few different people who have handled lots of antiques, and they also see similar things. Interestingly, it also appears that this applies to Japanese blades too. So I'm not a specialist on Nihonto or the Koryu martial arts associated with them, but many antique Japanese blades will also have marks on the spine. And what I've been told from an outside perspective is that they train to do lots of parries and blocks with the spine of the weapon. I've also seen images of tsuba that have nicks and cuts in them, and a lot of the time they are running parallel to the blade, which means that they're not turning their blade into those cuts, right? Those cuts are running alongside the flat of the blade. But that's just the evidence that we see on the antiques. I also think that it's important to consider the evidence that is not there, right? Or the lack of something. If we go to Western swords, they frequently have a section at the blade, the ricasso, which might not be sharpened, and its express purpose is to receive, blocks with the edge and then make your counter cut. On Chinese blades, I haven't seen damage to this area of the blade. And some of these antique blades also have a brass tunko, or like a blade collar at this point in the blade. And if that had received damage at some point in the life of the sword, it wouldn't be as easily polished out as, damage to the steel sections of the blade. And the brass wouldn't rust as fast, and it would preserve that damage for much longer. So to me, the antiques are suggesting that there's more parries with the spine and the flats than with the edge. If we move on to our next form of evidence, which is textual sources, then we can also see that there is a consideration for preserving the edge of your sword. One of the best sources for this is Chengzhongyou's 单刀法选, which I recently talked about in my last video. And in this text, there's actually one posture, or it's more like a principle of, it says that whenever you're fighting against a trident, which has iron bars that will catch your blows, it actually tells you to turn your sword around and strike with the spine of the blade, so that you're not going to damage your edge. So in a period source, we have this explicit reference of preserving your edge, right? They thought that it was important to do so. There are also some techniques in this manual, such as the Chao Tian Shi, which explicitly tell you to sweep away the incoming spear or thrust with the spine of your blade. There's also a technique which is called hooking, where you take the spine of your blade and you push the oncoming blow out of the way. And this is a technique that actually occurs in many different manuals of the Dao. Sometimes in these manuals they also explicitly tell you to cut into spear shafts and things like that. And I think the fact that they're emphasizing that might suggest that in general they're training to parry with the non-edge part of the sword. So in these period sources we can see that, a lot of the time you're going to be parrying with the spine of the blade, and you can use the edge to cut into spear shafts, but at the same time, whenever you're going against iron or steel weapons, you want to be cognizant of preserving your own edge. Now unfortunately we don't really have any sources that tell you how to parry or block with the Dao whenever you're in a dueling situation against another Dao, but this is where the third form of evidence, or the living tradition, can come in and help us fill in some of these gaps. So first I'd like to say that the way I view and interpret forms is largely influenced by my teachers, namely Scott Rodell, who does Yang Taiji, and Jeremy Thomas, who does Pak Mei. And if we look at the Dao Fa, or Dao methods, then I think that it's fairly clear that we are using the flat of the blade and relying on the discard to protect our hand whenever we're making many attacks. So in this part of the video, I'll be showing these movements, how they occur in many forms, and then I'll be showing kind of an interpretation of how I think this move works practically. It's important to keep in mind that these movements, they can have more than one kind of practical application to them, and also I'm doing a lot with my offhand, but this video is not about the offhand. That's for another video another day. This first movement is called a liao, which describes an upward cut from either side. First, I deflect with like a hanging parry called ti dao to the right side, and then I come with the right liao, and then I make a deflection with the flat, and then I do a liao from the left. This next movement is called jia, which means like a jab or thrust, and with the dao it's very commonly done to do these overhead descending thrusts, and this is something you see in a lot of forms. And you can see me doing this movement here. I'm using these very wide sweeping arcs. In reality, if you're doing this in a practical situation, you're going to tighten everything up, and you don't necessarily have to do these in the order that I'm doing them, but basically I'm receiving a blow on the flat, which if it slides down it hit the discard, so I can receive blows down on the flat and into the discard, and then thrust forward into the enemy from either side. And now we get to these head wrapping movements. These are super common in all kinds of forms, and in modern Chinese, whenever you wrap in front of your head and then behind, it's called chantou, and whenever you wrap or behind your head and then out in front, it's called guonao. And with these movements, I can receive a deflection on the flat and then come around with a big cut, but it's important to realize that you don't necessarily have to wrap around your head. I can also just receive the deflection in the same way and then cut straight out on either side. This next movement is one that I've seen in some old early 20th century footage of dao forms, and I've also seen it described in some texts such as the Da Dao manual and some other ones. And this is called gua, or hanging. Basically what it involves is it's a beating deflection, and let's say someone cuts or thrusts at you low, you do a beating deflection with the spine, and then you come across with your own cut. And you can kind of do this to either side. Now this next movement is called tiao or beng, depending on which style you study, and it's basically bringing the spine back towards you with a beating deflection and then going out forward with a cut. And here I'm doing it two different ways. You can do one that's powered with the wrist mostly, or one that's powered with your entire arm. And this is also a movement that's very common in jian techniques, and you do a false edge cut like this, but it's also a movement that can be used with the dao. So in light of all that evidence that I've shared, I think it's fairly safe to say that in China, they're mostly training to parry with the flat or the spine of the weapon as opposed to the edge. And the discard helps protect your hand whenever you're doing those actions. Thank you all for watching. Please subscribe and don't forget to stay sharp.